And now there are multiple ways for white to continue this game. Like white can develop this knight on f3, or maybe he can go for knight to d2. As well as white can also consider the move queen to b3, which maintains more pressure over the d5 pawn. But here Eugene decides to capture on d5 by c takes d5. And after that, e3, solidifying this d4 pawn as well as preparing to develop this knight on e2, which also keeps this diagonal open for this light square bishop. Whereas modern engines consider knight to f3 more active because by pushing this pawn to e3, it weakens this d3 and f3 square. And after that, here Fischer decides to castle. Okay, so after that, b6, preparing for bishop to b7, or maybe this bishop can also go to this a6 square so that he can create some pressure over this knight. And after that, here Eugene continues with b3 with the same idea of either bishop to b2 or maybe bishop to a3 so that he can put some pressure over this pawn. And after that, here Eugene goes for bishop to a3, which I mentioned you earlier, putting pressure over this e7 pawn so that he cannot easily move this e pawn further. And in this position, here is a famous quote by K.F. Kirby, a chess player and author from South Africa, and he was writing in the South African Chess Quarterly, who famously remarked on this position after white 11th move, which is like this: I should adjudicate his position as slightly superior and at worst completely safe. To turn this into a mating position in 11 more moves is more witchcraft than chess. And I think most of you didn't understand this, and basically this is a reaction, which means that this position looks harmless. White is fine, no danger. So how on earth does this turn into a forced mating so quickly? Which shows the next 11 brutal moves by Fischer, which turns this game in favor of him. And now Fischer continues with the move rook to e8, unpinning this e7 pawn, and now he is ready to push e5 in future. And after that, queen to d2, connecting both rooks, and now comes. And now for white, it's better to bring this rook on d1 square so that he can create more pressure over this d5 pawn. But instead, he brings the wrong rook, which is rook at f goes to d1. And that's an inaccuracy because you can see after placing this rook on d1, now this f2 pawn is weakened, and Fischer takes benefit of this by the move knight to d3. And now it's important for white to bring this knight to, yeah, so basically bring this knight to f4 so that he can exchange this dangerous knight, as well as now this queen is also guarding this f2 pawn. But he missed that move and he blunders by queen to c2. And in this position, Bobby Fischer sacrificed his knight by knight takes f2. And at this moment, Grandmaster Paul Banco and Arthur Bisguier were analyzing the game for spectators in a separate room at the Manhattan Chess Club when Fischer played this move knight takes f2. They told the audience that Fischer had blundered and now White was winning. They assumed that Fischer was playing for a desperado trick involving knight takes e1, which would fail because they didn't see any mating net. And that's the beauty of Fischer. They all forget that Fischer was stockfish at that time. And here White happily captured this knight on f2 by king takes f2, and now Fischer shows his real magic. He firstly gives a check from his knight by knight to g4, and obviously White cannot go to f1 due to the threat of knight takes f uh, n- due to the threat of knight takes f e3, and White has to lose his queen. And let's suppose if he goes for king to e1, then queen to f6, preparing for queen to f2 check. So to stop this, if king to d2, now comes queen to f2, targeting this e3 pawn. And if this king suppose goes back to c1, knight takes e3. Yeah, knight takes e3, and after that queen to d2. Okay, so hmm, let's suppose if he defends this queen, then White can bring his rook to c8, creating immense pressure. And you can see now the move. So now this move is coming and obviously White cannot recapture due to this. And now I think you all can see that this is all over for White. So that's why after seeing this all possibility, after this knight to g4 check, he goes for king to g1. And after queen to d2, now comes another beautiful move by Fischer, which is knight takes g2. And guys, that's a beautiful move because after queen to d2, yeah, so let me go back. Yeah, basically after this move, he didn't capture this rook. This is because let's suppose if he goes for knight takes d1, that will be a huge mistake because after rook takes d1, you can see White will continue by knight to f4. Now look at this pawn on d5. Uh, it's getting immense pressure by this queen, this rook, both knights as well as this bishop. And by this, you can see White is back into the game. So that's why after knight takes g2, basically he decides to capture this bishop on g2. This is because it is the most important defensive piece for White, which covers this weak which you can see which covers this f3 and h3 square around this king. By removing it, Fischer leaves the White king naked on the light square. Okay, so now this game continues by king takes h2, and now Fischer goes for d4. And another beautiful move by Fischer, opening the b7 diagonal for this bishop, and now he is ready to give a check in the next move. And in this position, the final blow by Fischer is queen to d7, and in this position, Eugene resigned. This is because, as you can see, Black is now threatening to give a check. And let's suppose if this game continues like knight to f3, and obviously he cannot go for this because then Black will capture this knight supported by this queen. Okay, so now comes queen to h3 check, queen to g2, queen to f5. Yeah, queen to f5, and in the next move Black is threatening to capture this knight. So to defend this, let's suppose if this king goes to f2, now comes bishop takes c3. And since this rook is attacked, so let's suppose if rook at a goes to c1, rook at a goes to d8, asking for rook exchange. But why? This is because if this rooks got traded, and obviously White cannot capture this bishop, then Black will go for queen to d2 check, taking benefit of this pinned pawn. So let's suppose if this king goes back to g1, finally bishop takes f3, and now there is nothing which White can do to save this game. Like this video and I will see you in the next one. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.